Before we begin, take a moment to leave a comment with where you are watching from and the exact time on your clock as these words reach you, because over years of examining sealed files and quiet discoveries, a pattern has emerged that cannot be measured without knowing when and where these accounts surface. And this story is no different. Beginning on a clear morning in late summer of 1953, when a routine task behind a family cellar crossed an unseen boundary that had been deliberately preserved beneath layers of earth and silence. The property sat on the edge of a small rural township where roads narrowed into gravel and the distances between homes stretched far enough that each household learned to solve its own problems before considering outside help. A place where basements were dug by hand and repairs were made with whatever tools were available, and where the land itself carried the weight of long memory, even when no one spoke of it. The family had lived there for years without incident, working the soil, maintaining the house, and treating the cellar as most rural families did, as practical space for storage, cooling, and shelter during storms, nothing more than an extension of daily life carved into the ground. That morning's task was simple by any measure. An effort to extend drainage away from the foundation after a wet season had left the cellar walls damp and the air faintly metallic, a smell associated with old stone and groundwater rather than anything alarming. Shovels struck dirt with the expected resistance until, without warning, one blow produced a sound that did not belong to soil or rock. A dull, resonant knock that carried through the ground and returned through the handle as a vibration felt more than heard. It was the kind of sound that caused movement to stop instinctively, not because it was loud, but because it was precise and bounded, as if the earth had briefly answered back. The family paused, listening to the space around them, to the wind moving through trees, to the distant hum of a road miles away, and then to the absence that followed, a stillness that made the sound feel less like an accident and more like a signal. Digging resumed carefully, not faster but slower, each scrape removing just enough soil to reveal a surface that should not have been there, smooth in a way natural stone is not, flat and uninterrupted, except for a seam that ran along one edge with a regularity that suggested intention. The material was neither brick nor poured concrete as they recognized it, but something older in composition and yet better preserved than expected, its edges sharp, its surface sealed against time by a technique that had resisted moisture for decades. Measurements taken with a tape borrowed from the cellar confirmed what instinct had already suggested, that this was not debris or a forgotten foundation, but a constructed plane extending beyond the width of the trench, continuing into the darkness under the yard with a geometry that contradicted the irregular history of the property. The family's initial response was not fear but confusion, followed quickly by the practical question of ownership and responsibility, because nothing like this appeared in the documents they had received when the property changed hands, and because the presence of such a structure raised questions that did not have simple answers. Soil composition around the surface showed no signs of disturbance beyond the immediate area, indicating that whatever lay beneath had been buried deliberately and then restored with care, the ground packed and aged until it blended seamlessly with its surroundings. The cellar wall itself showed a subtle alignment with the buried plane, as if the house had been positioned in relation to it rather than coincidentally above it, a detail that went unnoticed for years because it required comparison rather than observation. As the afternoon progressed, the work shifted from excavation to inspection, fingers tracing the seam, knuckles tapping to test thickness, and ears pressed close to listen for hollowness, and in doing so another anomaly emerged. A faint draft of cooler air moving upward through the soil, despite the absence of any visible opening, carrying with it a sterile, mineral scent, inconsistent with earth alone. That air suggested space, volume, and separation, and it did so without revealing anything else, an invitation that was also a warning. Conversation that evening turned repeatedly to the question of whether to continue, not framed as curiosity but as obligation, because once uncovered, even partially, the structure became something that demanded explanation, if only to ensure it posed no risk to the house above it. Notes were made, sketches drawn, and a decision reached to proceed cautiously, to widen the trench just enough to understand what had been uncovered before making any assumptions about its nature or origin. In the days that followed, the family's routines adjusted around the work behind the cellar. Meals were eaten earlier or later. Sleep was shortened by the persistence of unanswered questions. And attention was paid to small details that might otherwise have been ignored, like the way sound carried differently in that part of the yard, or how the ground seemed denser there, resisting tools with a firmness not found elsewhere. When a small section of the seam was cleared enough to reveal a recessed edge, it became apparent that the surface was not simply a slab, but a closure, a cap designed to meet something beneath it with exact tolerances, the kind of precision more often associated with institutional construction than private labor. There were no markings, no dates, no symbols to guide interpretation, only the consistency of workmanship and the unmistakable sense that whatever lay below had been sealed intentionally, not abandoned or forgotten. This realization marked a subtle shift in how the family regarded the discovery, transforming it from a problem to be solved into a threshold to be approached with care, because intention implied knowledge, and knowledge implied reasons that might extend beyond the present moment. As night fell, the trench was covered temporarily. Tools were cleaned and stored, and the yard was restored enough to prevent accidents. But sleep did not come easily, interrupted by the persistent awareness that something constructed, deliberate, and hidden lay just beyond the cellar wall, unchanged by decades of ordinary life above it. The next step would be to seek records, to ask questions framed carefully so as not to attract unnecessary attention, and to determine whether the structure was known to anyone else, because the longer it remained unexplained, the more it asserted itself as an absence in the official story of the property, a blank space that resisted being filled. This was the moment before escalation, when the discovery still existed in isolation, confined to a single family and a narrow strip of disturbed earth, and when the choice to proceed or stop would set in motion consequences that could not yet be seen, but would soon make it clear why what they had found had been sealed for a reason. The following morning began with an attempt to restore normalcy, a conscious decision to attend to chores and errands before returning to the space behind the cellar, as if routine might provide a buffer against whatever conclusions lay ahead. But even ordinary tasks carried a heightened awareness. Every sound evaluated, every absence noted, because once a sealed structure announces itself, it alters perception permanently. The decision to consult records was made cautiously, framed not as reporting a discovery, but as clarifying an architectural question, the kind of inquiry that could be justified without explanation. The county courthouse sat nearly an hour away by car, a low brick building whose interior smelled faintly of paper and polish, where requests were handled by clerks accustomed to property disputes and boundary clarifications rather than buried constructions. Land deeds were produced first, thick packets tied with string, each transfer documented meticulously, each description outlining acreage and landmarks, but never mentioning subterranean features beyond standard cellar foundations and utility trenches. Survey maps dating back decades were unrolled across a counter, their lines fading with age, but their precision intact, showing fences, tree lines, drainage paths, and even abandoned outbuildings. Yet the area behind the cellar was marked as unremarkable, indistinguishable from the rest of the yard. Building permits, where they existed, covered only visible structures, renovations to roofs and chimneys, repairs to stone walls, and nothing that suggested excavation beyond the cellar footprint. The absence of records did not confirm secrecy on its own, but combined with the quality of construction, it suggested a disconnect between documentation and reality that could not be dismissed easily. Questions were asked obliquely about prior owners, about unusual repairs or complaints, and about historical uses of the land during periods of rationing or emergency. And while answers were provided politely, they carried the subtle cues of disinterest that often accompany topics considered closed by time rather than actively concealed. A librarian was consulted next, her familiarity with local history extending beyond official ledgers into newspapers and personal collections. And while she recalled nothing matching the description, she did note that during certain years in the mid-century, records became thinner, not missing entirely but narrowed in scope, as if routine reporting had been streamlined or deferred. Returning home that afternoon, the family resumed work with renewed attention to detail, widening the trench incrementally, documenting depth and orientation, and confirming that the sealed surface extended further than initially believed, forming a rectangular boundary that paralleled the cellar wall at a consistent distance, a relationship too precise to be coincidental. When soil was cleared from one corner, the seam revealed itself as part of a larger frame, a recessed lip designed to accept the weight above it evenly, distributing the load in a way that protected whatever lay beneath from collapse. Tools used to probe thickness met uniform resistance, and tapping produced a consistent hollow response that confirmed a void below, its dimensions still unknown, but its presence undeniable. As daylight shifted, the family noted something else. A low vibration detectable only when standing close, not audible but perceptible through the soles of shoes, intermittent rather than constant, suggesting either airflow or mechanical resonance transmitted through dense material. This discovery introduced a new category of concern, because movement implied maintenance, or at least function, and function implied purpose beyond storage. That evening, notes were compared, sketches refined, and a decision reached to uncover enough of the seam to determine whether access was possible without breaching it fully, a compromise between curiosity and caution that acknowledged both the need to understand and the risk of crossing a threshold prematurely. Over the next several days, progress continued slowly, with the trench expanding along the length of the buried plane, revealing corners squared with a precision inconsistent with ad hoc construction and edges treated to resist erosion as if the builders anticipated long-term concealment rather than temporary closure. At one point, a small object was uncovered embedded in the surrounding soil, a fragment of treated metal no larger than a coin, bearing traces of a fastening system that did not match common hardware, its corrosion pattern indicating age without decay, an artifact that suggested specialized materials chosen for durability rather than convenience. Attempts to identify it through catalogs and reference books yielded nothing definitive, reinforcing the sense that this structure belonged to a category not represented in domestic construction guides. As excavation approached what appeared to be a central section of the seam, the faint draft strengthened, cool air flowing steadily upward when the soil was disturbed, carrying with it a dryness that contrasted sharply with the dampness of the surrounding earth, an engineered environment preserving conditions below despite seasonal changes above. This air movement made it increasingly difficult to ignore the possibility that the space beneath was sealed not merely to hide it, but to control it, to isolate it from external variables that might compromise its contents or function. The family debated whether to involve outside professionals, weighing the benefits of expertise against the loss of control that would follow, because once authorities were notified, the site would no longer belong to them in any meaningful way, and any answers provided would be filtered through institutional priorities rather than personal concern. In the end, they chose to continue privately for the moment, guided by the belief that understanding the nature of the structure would inform the next step more effectively than speculation. Late one afternoon, as the trench reached a depth sufficient to expose the underside of the seam, a subtle marking became visible along its edge. Not a symbol, but a series of shallow impressions spaced at regular intervals, too deliberate to be random but too worn to read as text, perhaps indicators of alignment or sequence, serving a function rather than conveying a message. This discovery shifted the investigation from material analysis to procedural inference, suggesting that the structure had been accessed, sealed, and possibly resealed according to a defined process, one that left traces only for those who knew how to look for them. As dusk settled, the family covered the trench once more, aware that the next phase would likely involve breaching the seal in some capacity, an act that would transform observation into participation, and that such a transition could not be undone. The house above them remained unchanged, its rooms occupied by ordinary objects and routines. Yet the awareness of the concealed structure beneath altered its atmosphere subtly, turning familiar spaces into vantage points, overlooking something unknown, something deliberately set apart. Sleep that night was light and fragmented, interrupted by the persistent sense of proximity to an engineered void and by the recognition that the absence of records, the precision of construction, and the evidence of controlled conditions all pointed toward a conclusion still forming, that whatever lay beneath the cellar had been designed to remain separate from ordinary life, and that uncovering it would inevitably draw that separation into question. By the third week after the initial discovery, the investigation had entered a quieter phase, one defined less by physical labor and more by the accumulation of small, corroborating details that resisted easy explanation, the kind that rarely make headlines but steadily erode assumptions. With the trench stabilized and marked, attention shifted decisively toward records and recollection, toward the possibility that the structure's absence from official documentation did not mean it was unknown, only that knowledge of it had been routed elsewhere. A second visit to the courthouse yielded little new on its own, but it did reveal patterns in what was missing rather than what was present. Entire years where ancillary files such as maintenance logs and inspection notes were thinner than expected, their summaries intact, but their attachments absent, as if the paperwork had been pared down deliberately to essentials. Requests for historical aerial photographs were met with delays attributed to misfiling, and when prints were finally produced, they showed the property at a resolution too coarse to reveal subsurface anomalies, yet sharp enough to confirm that no surface construction ever corresponded to the buried plain now exposed behind the cellar. The librarian's assistance became more pointed during a follow-up visit when she produced bound volumes of local newspapers from decades past, pages yellowed and brittle but preserved with care, and together they scanned columns for references to construction, disturbances, or unusual activity in the surrounding area, finding instead a conspicuous silence during periods when rural development elsewhere generated routine reporting. That silence was not absolute but selective, with stories of storms, harvests, and civic events continuing uninterrupted, creating a negative space where mention of anything beneath the ground might have been expected if it were ordinary. Conversations with older residents were approached carefully, framed as curiosity about property history rather than alarm. And while most recalled nothing specific, a few offered remarks that lingered, comments about sections of land that never flooded right or always felt colder, observations dismissed at the time as quirks, but now reframed by context. One neighbor recalled a brief period years earlier when surveyors appeared without announcement, setting markers that were later removed, their purpose never explained, and another mentioned a time when access to a nearby road was restricted temporarily for reasons that were never publicized. None of these accounts confirmed the existence of the structure directly, but together they suggested intermittent attention from outside parties, attention that left minimal trace once withdrawn. Meanwhile, examination of the structure itself continued incrementally, with careful cleaning revealing the seam's continuity along the entire exposed length, uninterrupted, except at one point where the material thickened slightly, forming a reinforced section that appeared designed to bear additional stress. This reinforcement aligned with the faint impressions noted earlier, implying that the seam was not merely a closure but a controlled interface, capable of being opened and sealed repeatedly without compromising integrity. The realization that the structure might have been accessed more than once introduced a new dimension to the investigation, one that shifted focus from a single moment of concealment to an ongoing process of use and containment. Tools used to probe the reinforced section met resistance that varied subtly with pressure, responding less like inert stone and more like layered components engineered to flex within narrow tolerances, a feature difficult to reconcile with purely domestic construction practices of the era. The family began keeping more formal notes, recording dates, times, and conditions under which observations were made, not because they expected scrutiny, but because the accumulation of data provided a sense of control amid growing uncertainty. Sleep disturbances became more common, not dramatic, but persistent, characterized by waking without clear cause and by a heightened awareness of the cellar's presence, even when distant from it, as if the knowledge itself exerted a low-level pressure. One evening, while reviewing notes by lamplight, a realization emerged that reframed earlier assumptions, that the absence of markings or identifiers on the structure might itself be a form of identification, a deliberate choice to render it anonymous, to ensure that only those already aware of its purpose could recognize it for what it was. This anonymity aligned with the selective gaps in records and the understated responses from institutions, suggesting a system designed to operate without acknowledgement rather than in secrecy alone. A decision was made to consult a professional discreetly, someone with technical expertise but no formal authority, and through a circuitous introduction, a retired engineer agreed to examine the exposed section under the guise of advising on drainage. His inspection was brief but telling, marked by a long silence as he ran his hands along the surface, tapped at intervals, and measured dimensions without comment, before finally emphasizing that whatever lay beneath was not improvised, that it reflected a level of planning and material selection inconsistent with private experimentation. He declined to speculate further, citing a lack of context, but his reluctance carried its own implication, that recognition of purpose sometimes precedes explanation, and that explanation is not always welcome. As days passed, the sense of approaching a boundary intensified, reinforced by the cumulative weight of details that pointed toward institutional involvement without ever naming it, a pattern of engagement and withdrawal that left the structure intact while allowing surrounding life to proceed. The family debated whether to stop, to backfill the trench, and restore the yard, effectively resealing the structure without ever breaching it. But the presence of the draft, the vibration, and the reinforced seam made such a decision feel incomplete, as if closing the surface without understanding what it contained would leave an unresolved risk beneath their home. The question was no longer simply what had been sealed, but why it continued to assert itself decades later, unchanged by time yet responsive to disturbance, a paradox that suggested ongoing relevance rather than historical curiosity. On the final evening before a decision was reached, the draft intensified briefly, noticeable enough to extinguish a candle held near the seam, a small but unmistakable demonstration of airflow that confirmed the existence of an internal environment capable of influencing the space above it. That moment crystallized the understanding that the structure was not inert, that it retained some form of internal logic or equilibrium, and that any attempt to ignore it would be an active choice rather than a neutral one. The next step, if taken, would involve breaching the seal in a controlled manner, an action that would irrevocably alter the relationship between the household and whatever lay beneath. And as notes were reviewed and tools prepared, the realization settled that the investigation had already crossed a threshold of awareness from which retreat would not restore the original state, because knowledge, once acquired, changes the ground it stands on. The decision to proceed was not announced so much as accepted, reached through a convergence of evidence rather than a single decisive moment, and carried out with the same measured restraint that had defined every step since the first strike of the shovel. Preparations were deliberate and conservative, guided by the understanding that whatever lay beyond the seal had been designed to remain isolated, and that breaching it without forethought would risk both structural instability and unknown secondary effects. The trench was widened incrementally to allow safer access, its edges shored with timber salvaged from the equipment shed, and the reinforced section of the seam was cleared completely, revealing a narrow rectangular plate set flush with the surrounding surface, its outline visible only where accumulated soil had previously obscured it. The plate's dimensions were precise, symmetrical, and inconsistent with ad hoc repair, suggesting a standardized component rather than a custom improvisation, and its surface bore faint abrasions that aligned with tool marks seen elsewhere, evidence of repeated interaction rather than a single act of closure. When pressure was applied at the plate's edge, using a pry bar padded with cloth to prevent chipping, the resistance yielded slightly, producing a dull, internal sound that differed markedly from the earlier hollow resonance, a denser, more controlled response, as though the force were being absorbed by layered mechanisms below. The moment was brief but unmistakable, confirming that the interface was active, engineered to move within limits rather than fracture, and that those limits had been tested before. A pause followed, during which no one spoke, as if the acknowledgement of that fact required space to settle, and when work resumed, it did so with heightened caution. The plate was not removed immediately. Instead, a narrow bore was drilled through its center using a hand auger, chosen for its slower pace and tactile feedback, allowing resistance to be felt rather than overridden. As the auger advanced, the material transitioned from stone-like hardness to a softer, composite resistance that produced fine particulate debris, unlike ordinary dust, darker and more fibrous, carrying a faint metallic tang that lingered in the air despite the open trench. When the auger broke through, the sensation was abrupt, the sudden loss of resistance accompanied by a subtle inward pull, as if air pressure equalized across the opening, and the draft intensified momentarily before settling into a steady, cool flow that contrasted sharply with the ambient temperature. A cloth held over the bore fluttered inward rather than away, confirming negative pressure below, a detail that shifted understanding from mere enclosure to regulated environment. The smell that followed was not immediately offensive, but complex and layered, combining the sterility of sealed spaces with undertones of aged paper and something faintly chemical, suggestive of preservation rather than decay. A small inspection mirror lowered through the bore revealed darkness, punctuated by the reflection of light, indicating depth beyond initial estimates, and as the mirror was angled, the beam caught on a surface below that appeared smooth and reflective, possibly metal or polished stone, arranged horizontally rather than vertically. This glimpse, fleeting as it was, introduced the first visual confirmation of an internal plane distinct from the outer shell, reinforcing the impression of deliberate compartmentalization. The bore was temporarily sealed with a rubber stopper while observations were recorded, and the decision was made to widen the opening gradually, prioritizing control over speed, an approach informed by the growing sense that the structure responded predictably to measured intervention, but resisted forceful intrusion. Over the next several hours, the plate was loosened incrementally, its edges freed until it could be lifted a fraction of an inch, enough to allow light to spill into the space below without fully exposing it. What became visible in that narrow gap altered the tone of the investigation immediately, shifting it from speculative to evidentiary, because beneath the plate lay not raw earth or an unfinished cavity, but a finished interior surface marked with straight lines and uniform textures, a constructed threshold rather than a void. The light revealed a ladder affixed to the inner wall, its rungs evenly spaced and anchored with hardware that matched the quality seen above, confirming that the space was intended for regular human access. The ladder's surface showed wear consistent with use, not heavy but unmistakable, the edges smoothed by repeated contact, a detail that suggested duration rather than intensity. At that point, the plate was lifted fully and set aside, exposing an opening just wide enough to allow descent, and the draft stabilized again, flowing steadily upward, as if the system were compensating for the change in configuration. A lantern lowered into the opening illuminated more of the interior, revealing walls finished to a degree comparable to institutional basements or utility corridors, neither decorative nor crude, but functional and precise, with conduits running along one side and disappearing into the darkness below. No sound emanated from the space beyond the draft itself, a silence that felt deliberate rather than empty. And as the lantern was raised and lowered again, the beam caught on a series of markings near the base of the ladder, small etched symbols accompanied by dates, each aligned carefully, forming a vertical sequence that extended downward out of view. The realization that these markings represented a record, not incidental graffiti, introduced a new layer of meaning to the structure, suggesting that entry and exit had been documented, tracked, and perhaps even audited. A decision was made not to descend immediately, to document the opening thoroughly before altering conditions further, and photographs were taken with long exposures to capture as much detail as possible, each image reviewed carefully for anomalies. In one frame, a faint reflection appeared at the edge of the lantern's light, not corresponding to any visible object, a detail dismissed initially as an artifact until repeated in subsequent images, always at the same relative position, implying a reflective surface deeper within the space. As evening approached, the opening was covered temporarily with a fitted panel to limit exposure, not to reseal it completely, but to restore partial equilibrium, while plans were made for a controlled entry the following day. That night, sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the awareness that a sealed boundary had been crossed, that the space beneath the cellar was no longer hypothetical, and that the structure's design, its responsiveness, and its internal order all pointed toward a purpose that extended beyond storage or shelter. The threshold now lay open, and with it came the understanding that entry would not simply reveal contents, but initiate a sequence of obligations, a shift from observer to participant in a process whose origins and endpoints were still obscured. Entry was delayed by design rather than hesitation, postponed to allow documentation to catch up with action, because it had become clear that the interior was not merely a space to be observed, but a system to be understood, one that relied on records as much as physical barriers. The opening remained covered overnight, monitored intermittently to note any changes in airflow, temperature, or sound, and each observation was logged with the same precision that had governed the excavation. By morning, measurements confirmed that internal conditions were stable, the draft consistent, the temperature several degrees lower than the surrounding soil, and the humidity unusually regulated for a sealed subterranean environment. These details mattered because they suggested maintenance beyond passive containment, implying design decisions that anticipated long-term occupancy or use. When the panel was removed again and the ladder prepared for descent, the first person to enter carried not only lighting, but also a notebook sealed in oilcloth, its pages pre-numbered to ensure nothing could be added later without detection. The descent itself was slow and methodical, each rung tested before weight was shifted, and as the lantern lowered, the interior resolved into clearer focus, revealing a chamber larger than expected, rectangular, with walls reinforced by poured concrete lined with metal panels at regular intervals. The floor was smooth, bearing faint scuff marks that traced predictable paths between key points, not random movement but repeated routines, and at the far end of the chamber stood a table constructed of steel framing and a thick composite surface scarred by tool marks. Its placement deliberate, centered beneath a set of overhead fixtures that resembled industrial lighting rather than residential fittings. Along the walls were cabinets, each numbered, their doors secured by simple mechanical latches rather than locks, an arrangement that suggested access control by protocol rather than force. When the nearest cabinet was opened, its contents confirmed that impression immediately, because inside were not tools or supplies in the conventional sense, but folders, each labeled with dates and short alphanumeric codes, their uniformity striking in a way that transcended individual handwriting. The paper within was heavy stock, watermarked, its edges clean despite the environment, indicating storage conditions designed to preserve integrity, and as one folder was removed and opened, the nature of the space shifted again, from engineered enclosure to archive. The documents inside were logs, not narratives, written in terse, standardized language, each entry dated and time-stamped, describing actions taken, materials moved, inspections conducted, and conditions verified, with little embellishment and no personal commentary. Names were absent, replaced by role identifiers and procedural references, reinforcing the sense that the record was meant to function independently of individual custodians. Several entries referenced the structure itself using coded terminology that recurred across folders, suggesting an internal taxonomy, and cross-references pointed to other documents, indicating a system of redundancy meant to survive partial loss. As more folders were examined, patterns emerged, including recurring inspection intervals, periodic maintenance tasks, and annotations indicating deviations from expected conditions, each followed by corrective actions that restored equilibrium. One entry noted a seal adjustment performed years after the initial closure, contradicting assumptions that the structure had been abandoned or forgotten, and another referenced a transfer of custodianship using language that mirrored property conveyance, but applied to responsibility rather than ownership. These details reframed the space not as a hidden anomaly, but as an operational site integrated into a broader administrative framework. At the table lay additional materials, including a bound ledger thicker than the folders, its cover unmarked but its spine reinforced, suggesting frequent use, and when opened, it revealed an index correlating dates, codes, and locations, extending beyond the chamber itself to references that implied multiple sites operating under similar protocols. This realization marked a critical escalation because it meant the discovery was not isolated but part of a distributed system, one that relied on replication rather than singularity, and the ledger's final pages contained entries far more recent than expected, indicating activity within living memory rather than the distant past. The psychological impact of this shift was subtle but profound, because it transformed the narrative from historical curiosity to active legacy, raising questions about continuity and oversight that could not be answered locally. As documentation continued, a section of the chamber previously obscured by shadow came into focus, revealing a secondary door set flush into the far wall, its surface bearing the same composite material as the original plate above, scaled to human passage, and sealed with a mechanism identical in principle but smaller in form. This door was not opened, its presence alone sufficient to suggest compartmentalization within compartmentalization, layers of access governed by criteria not yet understood. Near the door was a panel displaying faded markings that resembled scheduling charts, columns, and rows, etched into the surface and filled with symbols matching those seen in the ledger, reinforcing the connection between space and record, action and documentation. No attempt was made to breach this inner seal, and its existence was recorded photographically without physical interaction, respecting an unspoken boundary that had formed organically as understanding deepened. The chamber's design now appeared intentional to a degree that challenged assumptions about scale and authority, because the resources required to build, document, and maintain such a system implied institutional backing, or at least institutional mimicry, and the absence of overt identifiers suggested deliberate anonymity rather than neglect. When the initial survey concluded, the decision was made to withdraw and review findings before proceeding further, not out of fear, but recognition that entry had triggered an ethical threshold as much as a physical one. The opening was secured again, not sealed permanently, but stabilized, and the day's documentation was collated, photographed, and duplicated, each copy stored separately to guard against loss. That evening, as notes were reviewed, the language of the logs echoed in the mind, its procedural neutrality masking implications that were anything but neutral, and it became increasingly difficult to view the structure as inert. The records did not simply describe containment, they enacted it, turning actions into data and data into justification, a cycle that perpetuated itself through adherence rather than enforcement. By the end of that review, one conclusion had become unavoidable. The chamber was not merely sealed for safety or secrecy, but as part of a process designed to outlast individual awareness, to persist through normalization and transfer, and the act of discovering it had already altered the balance it was meant to preserve. By the time attention turned outward again, it was no longer possible to treat the discovery as a private matter, even though no announcement had been made and no formal report submitted. The chamber's existence, exerted pressure beyond its physical boundaries, influencing routines and decisions in ways that were difficult to quantify but increasingly apparent. Sleep patterns shifted first, not dramatically, but subtly, with nights broken by intervals of wakefulness that coincided with remembered phrases from the logs, fragments of procedural language repeating without context. Meals were delayed or skipped, replaced by long periods of review, as if the act of reading had become a form of vigilance rather than inquiry. The land itself began to feel altered, not in appearance but in function. Its familiar paths, now mapped mentally against references found in the ledger, each fence line and outbuilding acquiring potential relevance within a system that had not been intended for lay understanding. It was during this period that the first indications of external awareness surfaced, quietly and without confrontation. Utility records showed a minor but consistent anomaly in electrical load, not enough to prompt immediate inquiry, but sufficient to register as a deviation from baseline, and the timing of these fluctuations aligned with moments when the chamber was accessed or monitored. At first, this was attributed to equipment testing, but follow-up checks confirmed no active machinery beyond lighting and ventilation, raising the possibility that monitoring extended beyond what was visible. Shortly thereafter, a routine visit by a local official took on disproportionate significance, not because of anything said, but because of what was asked indirectly. Questions about recent improvements, subsurface work, and compliance with zoning regulations were framed casually, almost apologetically. Yet the specificity suggested prior knowledge rather than coincidence. No documentation was requested at that time, and no inspection was scheduled, but the visit left behind an impression of being cataloged, a sense that the discovery had registered somewhere beyond immediate jurisdiction. In response, documentation practices intensified, not out of paranoia, but as a defensive measure. Each interaction logged with the same rigor observed in the chamber's records, mirroring the system's own language in an effort to remain legible to it. This mirroring produced an unexpected effect, as adopting the cadence and structure of the logs began to shape perception itself, encouraging interpretation through procedural lenses rather than emotional ones. Conversations became reports, observations became findings, and concern was reframed as risk assessment, a transformation that felt adaptive at first, even stabilizing. Yet, as days passed, this mode of engagement deepened, narrowing focus and reducing tolerance for ambiguity, because the system implied by the chamber did not accommodate uncertainty well. It operated on thresholds and criteria, on actions taken or not taken, and the absence of response became its own data point. When correspondence was sent to regional archives requesting clarification on property records, the reply arrived faster than expected, courteous but uninformative, stating simply that no relevant files were available for public access and that further inquiries should be directed through established channels. The phrasing was familiar, echoing the language of restriction found in the logs, and its neutrality carried a weight that more explicit denial might not have. Around the same time, subtle behavioral shifts became noticeable to those nearby, changes that would later be remarked upon in retrospect as early indicators of deeper involvement. Time spent on the land increased, not for productive labor, but for observation, standing still for long stretches as if listening for cues that never materialized. Social engagements were postponed or declined, justified by the need to complete documentation or resolve outstanding questions, explanations that were technically true but increasingly insufficient. The ledger's taxonomy began to inform how people and events were categorized, reducing complexity to roles and functions, a habit that made interactions feel efficient but hollow. It was in this narrowed state that the first clear sign of oversight appeared, unmistakable in its intent, despite its subtlety. One evening, while reviewing duplicated records, it became apparent that a document previously copied was no longer in its original location, not missing entirely but repositioned, its absence temporary and precise. No sign of forced entry was found, and nothing else had been disturbed, yet the implication was undeniable. Access had been gained, a review conducted, and order restored without acknowledgement. The response to this realization was not panic but recalibration, an instinctive alignment with the chamber's logic, recognizing that visibility was conditional and discretion expected. From that point forward, actions were weighed not only against personal judgment, but against an imagined set of criteria inferred from the system itself, an internalization that marked a significant psychological threshold. Surveillance, once suspected, became assumed, and with that assumption came a form of compliance that was difficult to distinguish from prudence. Even private thoughts began to adopt procedural framing, as if anticipating transcription, and the idea of stepping away from the process felt less like freedom and more like abdication. This internal shift was mirrored by changes in the physical environment. Small adjustments made unconsciously to reduce visibility, to minimize noise, and to align with patterns suggested by the logs, such as conducting reviews at specific hours or maintaining consistent routines. The land settled into a quieter rhythm, its isolation now serving not as refuge but as insulation, buffering the system from external scrutiny. It was during this period that the notion of obligation emerged fully, no longer abstract but personal, rooted in the understanding that discovery carried responsibility by design. The chamber had not been sealed merely to hide it, but to ensure continuity through selective revelation, and those who encountered it were not accidental witnesses, but potential custodians. This realization reframed earlier actions, casting the careful documentation and restrained inquiry as tests rather than choices, assessments of suitability conducted through exposure rather than interview. The weight of this interpretation pressed heavily, not because it was explicitly stated, but because it fit the evidence too well to dismiss. As weeks passed, the question was no longer whether the system existed, but whether it could be disengaged from without consequence, and no precedent within the records suggested that withdrawal was an option. The logs spoke only of transfer, of handover and adjustment, never of termination, and this absence loomed larger than any explicit warning. By the time the first formal notice arrived, requesting a routine review of subsurface structures under revised safety guidelines, the sense of inevitability had already taken hold, and the response was prepared with a calm that felt earned rather than chosen, composed in the language of compliance that had become second nature. The notice did not arrive as a threat, nor even as a warning, but as an invitation framed in the careful language of procedure, its tone neutral and its timing precise. It referenced updated standards, routine evaluations, and the importance of alignment with best practices, phrases that carried no overt menace yet implied a framework within which deviation would be visible. Preparation for the review unfolded almost automatically, guided less by instruction than by accumulated understanding of how the system was expected to be met. Documents were organized according to categories inferred from the chamber's own taxonomy, duplicates verified, and a chronology assembled that emphasized continuity and compliance over discovery and disruption. The physical site was stabilized further, not concealed anew but maintained in a state that suggested stewardship rather than intrusion, and this distinction mattered because it aligned with the role that now seemed inevitable. Social withdrawal deepened during this period, not dramatically but decisively, as time and attention narrowed around the obligations that had emerged. Conversations with neighbors became shorter and more functional, focused on weather and maintenance rather than plans or speculation, and this narrowing mirrored patterns noted in the logs where external engagement diminished as custodianship intensified. The psychological shift was gradual enough to feel voluntary, even rational, yet its cumulative effect was unmistakable, reshaping priorities and perceptions until alternatives felt impractical. When the review occurred, it was conducted with the same restraint that characterized the notice, involving individuals whose authority was implied rather than declared, their questions precise, and their interest bounded by clearly defined parameters. They did not ask about the origins of the chamber or its broader implications, focusing instead on current conditions, documentation integrity, and adherence to established protocols, as if the past were less relevant than the system's present functionality. This focus reinforced the understanding that the chamber's significance lay not in what it represented historically, but in what it continued to do, a distinction that further entrenched the sense of obligation. The review concluded without incident, no directives issued, no sanctions implied. Yet its aftermath lingered, solidifying the transition from discoverer to custodian. From that point forward, actions were no longer exploratory but maintenance-oriented, guided by schedules and checklists derived from the logs, and the act of compliance brought with it a perverse sense of stability. This stability, however, was fragile, dependent on constant attention and vigilance, because deviation now carried the risk of exposure, not of the chamber itself, but of failure to uphold its continuity. Relationships strained under this new regime, not through conflict, but through absence, as shared routines eroded and priorities diverged, leaving behind a quiet distance that mirrored the isolation documented in prior custodians' records. Attempts to articulate the burden proved futile, because the obligation resisted translation into ordinary language, its logic procedural rather than emotional. This incommunicability reinforced isolation, making the chamber the primary site of engagement, and the logs the dominant narrative through which experience was processed. Over time, the moral weight of the role became clearer, not through overt instruction, but through accumulated implication, as it became evident that the system's endurance depended on acceptance rather than coercion. The chamber did not demand loyalty. It assumed it, and this assumption shaped behavior more effectively than any explicit threat. The cost of this acceptance was subtle but pervasive, eroding spontaneity and narrowing the range of permissible action until life itself felt indexed, its value measured in terms of risk mitigation and continuity preservation. Yet, within this constraint, a sense of purpose emerged, rooted in the belief that maintaining the system prevented unknown consequences, that containment served a function beyond individual understanding. This belief was not entirely unfounded, supported by references in the logs to prior disruptions and their aftermaths, though details were sparse and outcomes implied rather than described. The absence of explicit justification paradoxically strengthened the compulsion, because it left room for projection, for imagining consequences severe enough to warrant sacrifice. As seasons turned, routines solidified, and the chamber receded into the background of daily life, its presence normalized through repetition. The transformation was complete not when resistance ceased, but when it no longer occurred, replaced by a quiet acceptance that felt indistinguishable from choice. In this state, the question of leaving, once a distant consideration, became almost unthinkable, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer aligned with the internal logic that now governed perception. The chamber had not merely been found, it had been inherited, along with the obligations encoded in its records, and this inheritance bound the present to a future defined by maintenance rather than resolution. The official intervention that followed did not announce itself as such, arriving instead as an administrative adjustment framed in neutral terms, its authority expressed through forms and schedules rather than uniforms or directives. It began with a notification of reclassification, a change in how the land and its subsurface features were indexed within regional records, justified by updated criteria related to safety, environmental integrity, and historical preservation. The language was careful, almost courteous, emphasizing cooperation and shared responsibility, and it included a request for acknowledgement rather than consent, signaling that the decision had already been made. Compliance was expected, not negotiated. The practical effects of this reclassification were immediate but understated, introducing new reporting requirements and inspection intervals that mirrored those already observed internally, aligning external oversight with established routines in a way that felt less like intrusion than synchronization. This alignment reinforced the impression that the system had anticipated such moments, that escalation into formal oversight was a planned phase rather than an unforeseen consequence. Meetings were conducted at the edge of the property, brief and focused, their purpose limited to verification rather than exploration, and questions were confined to parameters already documented, avoiding any inquiry that might unsettle the equilibrium that had been so carefully maintained. The chamber itself was not open during these interactions, its existence acknowledged indirectly through references to subsurface considerations, as if naming it directly would introduce instability. Documentation was reviewed selectively, with emphasis on completeness and consistency rather than content, and discrepancies were noted quietly and resolved through addenda rather than challenge. The process conveyed a clear message. The goal was not to uncover truth, but to ensure continuity under revised jurisdiction. Following this intervention, access protocols tightened incrementally, not through locks or barriers, but through scheduling and authorization layers that limited spontaneity. Entry times were fixed, monitoring equipment standardized, and the act of record duplication formalized, each step reducing individual discretion while preserving operational flow. This shift altered the psychological landscape further, transferring responsibility from personal judgment to procedural adherence, a move that brought relief alongside constraint. Decisions were now justified by reference to guidelines rather than intuition, diffusing accountability across an abstract framework that insulated participants from direct moral reckoning. Yet this diffusion came at a cost, because it rendered dissent incoherent, reframing ethical concern as procedural deviation rather than legitimate objection. Social normalization followed swiftly. As the reclassified land attracted new descriptions in public records, its history condensed into benign categories that obscured the chamber's significance without erasing it entirely. Neighbors adjusted without comment, accepting minor changes in access and activity as routine administrative updates, and the broader community remained unaware of the deeper implications, their daily lives continuing atop a foundation now officially managed. Internally, the logs expanded to include correspondence summaries and inspection outcomes, integrating oversight into the existing archival structure. And this integration marked a turning point because it transformed the chamber from a hidden anomaly into a regulated asset. The language of containment shifted accordingly, emphasizing preservation and risk mitigation over secrecy, a reframing that legitimized the system's endurance within institutional norms. As months passed, the memory of the initial discovery faded, replaced by the steady cadence of compliance, and the chamber's presence became an accepted constant, its maintenance as routine as any other obligation. The emotional residue of unease did not disappear, but it was compartmentalized, stored alongside unanswered questions that no longer demanded resolution. The intervention had succeeded not by force but by absorption, drawing the anomaly into a bureaucratic framework that neutralized its disruptive potential while preserving its function. In this way, containment was achieved not through sealing alone, but through normalization, ensuring that the chamber remained active yet unremarkable, its influence diffused across layers of administration that rendered it invisible to those without cause to look closely. After the intervention, what followed was not resolution, but redistribution, a gradual reassignment of responsibility that unfolded through paperwork and jurisdictional shifts rather than public announcement. The land status changed again, this time through consolidation. Its designation was folded into a broader category that emphasized stewardship and restricted use, a move justified by long-term planning objectives that were never fully articulated. Ownership became abstracted, passing from individual hands into layered administration, each transfer documented meticulously, each reducing the likelihood that any single party would feel authorized to question what lay beneath. This abstraction extended to memory itself, as references to the chamber were condensed into standardized descriptors that stripped away specificity, replacing it with language that suggested potential without detail. The physical site was altered subtly but decisively. Access routes rerouted, surface features adjusted to discourage curiosity, and signage updated to emphasize environmental sensitivity and safety, cues that redirected attention away from inquiry toward compliance. The chamber remained intact, untouched by these surface changes, its integrity preserved through engineering assessments that focused on stability rather than content, and its maintenance folded into routine inspections that treated it as infrastructure rather than an anomaly. Documentation expanded accordingly, with new layers of record-keeping that mirrored older logs in structure, if not in tone. Their entries increasingly administrative, their purpose oriented toward continuity rather than understanding. Those involved in this transition experienced a quiet dislocation, a sense that the core of the matter had been relocated beyond reach, not hidden so much as dispersed, its significance diluted across processes that no longer required comprehension to function. Attempts to trace authority led only to circular references, offices that deferred to other offices, each pointing elsewhere with polite certainty, creating a closed loop that absorbed inquiry without yielding answers. Over time, the routines established during custodianship outlived their original context, persisting as habits divorced from their initiating cause, and this persistence marked the final phase of normalization, where actions continued because they had become standard rather than necessary. The chamber's logs were archived under restricted access, their classification justified by potential risk to public safety and the integrity of investigative methods, and requests for review were met with uniform denials that cited ongoing relevance without elaboration. These denials were consistent, their language unchanged across years, suggesting automation or policy rather than deliberation, and their predictability further eroded the impulse to challenge. As personnel rotated and roles changed, institutional memory thinned, leaving behind procedures without narrative, a shell of compliance that maintained function while obscuring origin. The chamber's influence persisted nonetheless, shaping decisions indirectly through constraints embedded in policy, its existence a silent factor in land use, planning, and risk assessment models that treated it as a fixed variable. Those who had been closest to the discovery receded from view, their involvement concluding not with closure, but with transition. Their records folded into larger files, their names replaced by identifiers that marked roles rather than experiences. In this way, personal accountability dissolved into systemic operation, a process that felt both relieving and unsettling because it removed burden while also erasing agency. The land itself adapted to its new identity, its surface repurposed for uses that aligned with its classification. Activities that brought people close without granting access, proximity without knowledge. Visitors passed through unaware, their presence recorded only in aggregate, their movements constrained by pathways designed to protect what they could not see. The chamber remained beneath them, unchanged, its sealed entrances monitored by instruments that translated physical conditions into data streams, each reading confirming stability, each deviation triggering protocols refined over decades. This steady state created the illusion of completion, a sense that the matter had been addressed and resolved through management rather than confrontation. Yet beneath this veneer, unresolved questions lingered. Preserved within the restricted archives, their answers deferred indefinitely under the logic of precaution. Occasional anomalies surfaced. Minor fluctuations or unexplained maintenance events prompted brief internal discussions. But these were handled within established frameworks, their significance assessed and contained without escalation. The pattern held, not because it was understood, but because it was supported by structures that favored continuity over inquiry. In the absence of an overt crisis, the system proved resilient, its capacity to absorb uncertainty, a testament to its design. Over years, the chamber's story faded from local consciousness, its presence reduced to a footnote in administrative history, while its operational reality continued uninterrupted. This fading was not accidental but engineered, the result of deliberate choices that prioritized stability and discretion, ensuring that what lay beneath would remain beneath, not through secrecy alone, but through the quiet efficiency of bureaucracy. The aftermath thus resolved into a state of managed ambiguity, where the extraordinary was rendered ordinary by process, and the past remained active not as memory, but as function. In the present day, nothing about the surface suggests interruption. The land bears the marks of careful management rather than concealment, its boundaries clearly defined, its uses consistent with its designation, and its appearance unremarkable to those without reason to look closer. Seasonal changes pass over it without incident, cycles of growth and dormancy proceeding as expected, and the routines that govern access and oversight continue quietly, embedded in schedules and maintenance logs that require no explanation beyond their own existence. Instruments remain in place beneath the soil, their readings transmitted at regular intervals, each data point confirming stability, each confirmation reinforcing the assumption that the system is functioning as intended. These readings are reviewed by individuals who inherit responsibility without context, their training focused on thresholds and response protocols rather than origin or meaning, and this abstraction is key to the endurance of the arrangement. The chamber persists not because it is remembered, but because it is accounted for, its presence reduced to parameters that can be managed without understanding. From time to time, inquiries arise, prompted by anomalies in historical records or by the curiosity of those who notice inconsistencies between maps and terrain. But these inquiries are redirected efficiently, met with explanations that satisfy procedural requirements without inviting further exploration. The language used remains consistent, emphasizing safety, preservation, and jurisdiction, concepts broad enough to encompass nearly any restriction while remaining difficult to contest. In this way, the site exists simultaneously as fact and absence, acknowledged within certain systems and invisible within others, its significance compartmentalized according to need. Those who live nearby are aware only of the rules that shape their interaction with the land, not the reasons behind them. And over time, even these rules become background, accepted as part of the landscape rather than imposed upon it. The routines established decades earlier continue to govern engagement, their origins obscured by layers of revision and reinterpretation, until compliance no longer feels like acquiescence, but simply the way things are done. The Chamber's records remain sealed within archives that few are authorized to access, their contents preserved in controlled environments designed to ensure longevity without exposure. Requests for review are rare now, and when they occur, they are addressed with the same uniformity that has characterized the system from the beginning, with responses generated through established channels that leave no room for deviation. This consistency is often cited as evidence of effective management, a sign that the matter has been resolved, yet resolution here does not mean closure, only equilibrium. The questions that once drove discovery have not been answered. They have been deferred, placed beyond reach through mechanisms that prioritize stability over clarity. In quiet moments, when attention drifts and the procedural cadence slows, the persistence of the chamber becomes apparent not as a threat, but as a condition, a reminder that certain systems are designed to endure precisely by resisting conclusion. The past remains active beneath the present, not erupting or demanding acknowledgement, but exerting influence through constraints and continuities that shape behavior without announcing themselves. This influence is subtle, its effects cumulative rather than dramatic, and it thrives in environments where routine overrides reflection. The land does not reveal what it contains, and the systems that govern it do not require revelation to function, relying instead on adherence to rules whose justification lies elsewhere. In this way, the chamber fulfills its purpose, whatever that may have been, not by secrecy alone, but by integration into the ordinary mechanisms of oversight that define modern management. The silence that surrounds it is not empty, it is structured, maintained through deliberate choices that transform absence into policy. Those choices are rarely questioned, because they are framed as protective, and protection is difficult to argue against, especially when the alternative is undefined. Yet the cost of this protection is a narrowing of perspective, a willingness to accept that some things are better left unexamined, not because they are dangerous in themselves, but because examining them would disrupt systems that depend on continuity. This acceptance is widespread, embedded in professional norms, and reinforced through training that emphasizes process over interpretation. As a result, the chamber remains, its existence, a quiet constant beneath layers of soil and administration, its story incomplete but stable. The unresolved nature of that story is not considered a failure, but a feature, evidence that the system is working as designed. For those who consider such patterns, who notice how often extraordinary histories are managed into invisibility through procedure rather than force, the site serves as a case study in how containment operates in practice. It demonstrates that the most enduring forms of secrecy are not enforced through fear, but through normalization, through the steady application of rules that render inquiry unnecessary. If this kind of story matters to you, if you value careful examination of how buried histories persist beneath ordinary life and how systems are built to absorb and silence disruption, then staying with this work matters. Subscribing is not about anticipation of spectacle, but about supporting the continued uncovering of patterns that remain active precisely because they have been made to feel unremarkable